At her husband's funeral, her son told the mourners, "Let her grieve quietly." But Lucille wasn't grieving. She was remembering. Remembering decades of control disguised as care. Remembering a life she never truly owned. And as the dirt hit the casket, she made a silent vow. If they buried the truth with him, she'd dig up every secret they tried to hide. A locked drawer, a forged will, a hidden apartment, and a woman no longer willing to disappear quietly. This isn't grief. This is revenge, dressed in silk and silence. The wind bit through the thick wool of my coat as I stepped from the car. The sky a low-hung ceiling of gray. Church bells tolled, each note deliberate and final. The cemetery was already filled with guests, their dark coats blending into one indistinct mass, like shadows cast on a forgotten stage. I walked slowly, every step calculated, not out of reverence but necessity. My legs were still learning how to carry a body no longer afraid. A black veil shielded my face, though not from grief. It was a shroud between me and the world. One final courtesy I offered out of habit, not sorrow. My eyes locked onto the casket as the pallbearers lowered it gently. Even in death, Franklin commanded the room. The polished mahogany gleamed under the faint sunlight, an overcompensation that felt both familiar and ironic. I heard murmurs behind me, some genuine condolences, some not. And then a voice, firm and deliberate, sliced through the hushed crowd. "Let her grieve quietly." "Griffin, my son." His voice was steady, authoritative, the same cadence his father used when dismissing opinions. A part of me flinched, not because he spoke, but because he sounded so much like the man we were burying. Heads turned, lips pursed. Conversation ceased. Quiet. Yes, I thought. Let me grieve. But not for him, not for Franklin. Let me grieve for every year I spent inside a home I never belonged in. For the woman I was before he taught me silence was safer than truth. Let me mourn the life I gave to someone who fed on control and called it love. Griffin stood just a few steps away, his jaw clenched, eyes unreadable behind mirrored sunglasses. His posture was perfect, like always. He'd worn that mask since he was 12. I'd watched Franklin mold him into a mirror image. Clara, Griffin's wife, stood beside him, her lips drawn into a neutral line, her arm looped gently but possessively through his. She didn't look at me. She hadn't looked at me once since we arrived. I clutched the funeral program, the edge digging into my palm. My fingers wouldn't stop trembling. Not from sadness, from the weight of everything I couldn't say. The paper crinkled under the pressure, like my voice had for decades. The wind picked up suddenly, pulling my scarf loose from around my neck. It whipped behind me like a ribbon, the same soft blue Franklin once said made me look childish. I didn't retrieve it. As the minister began to speak, I drifted backward, standing on the periphery of the mourners. My back to the weeping, my mind elsewhere. People would say I was distant, cold, ungrateful, maybe even relieved. They'd be right, but none would guess the depth of what I carried. The strangest part of losing Franklin wasn't the loss itself. It was the realization that I didn't feel lost. I felt free, and that terrified me. From the corner of my eye, I saw Clara lean toward Griffin, her lips barely moving, whispering. Her eyes flicked toward me and away again like I was something under glass, a specimen to be observed but never touched. He must have told her stories about me. I wondered which ones. I listened as the minister quoted scripture about eternal love, about faith and devotion and unity. I nearly laughed. Franklin was a man who made religion out of control. He didn't believe in God. He believed in being obeyed. He believed in legacy. And in his mind, that legacy was standing right in front of me, hands folded, eyes dry, wearing a $1,000 suit and a borrowed soul. The last time Franklin and I stood face to face, he told me, "A quiet woman is a respectable one." I had nodded then. I always nodded. But inside, something rebelled, something ancient, something I didn't have words for yet. My silence hadn't been respect. It had been survival. The service dragged on. Eulogies from colleagues, men who admired Franklin's tenacity, business acumen, and unshakable discipline. I stared at the casket, wondering if any of them knew the man behind the office door, the one who criticized every meal I cooked, the one who asked why I needed books when the house had a TV. The one who gave me an allowance like I was a child, who monitored every dollar, who read my emails without ever admitting it. And yet I stayed. Not because I loved him, not even because I feared him, though I did. I stayed because I didn't know how to leave. Until now. I remembered the day we got married. I was 21, eyes full of hope, wearing a dress that Franklin picked out because mine was too loud. He smiled for the cameras and whispered in my ear, "You'll be my greatest investment." At the time, I thought it was romantic. I thought love meant becoming part of someone else's dream. I didn't realize I was disappearing. A tap on my arm startled me. I turned to see Delilah, my old friend, the only one who had dared to tell me I looked tired when others said I glowed. She wore a simple black dress, her curls pinned up like they always had been in college. Her eyes held the kind of compassion that burned. "You okay?" she whispered. I nodded. I didn't trust my voice. "I'm around. When you're ready." I almost said, "Ready for what?" But I knew she meant ready to speak, ready to unravel, ready to live. The wind had died down. The bells had stopped. The casket was now half swallowed by earth. People began to disperse, murmuring plans for lunch or flights back home. Griffin approached me, his face unreadable. "We'll take care of the estate," he said quietly, formally. "Of course," I replied, equally detached. He looked as if he wanted to say more, but didn't. Clara hovered just behind him, her eyes scanning the crowd as if someone might be watching. "Thank you for coming," I added, as though he were a guest and not my child. He nodded once, then turned away. I didn't watch them leave. Instead, I stayed. Alone for a long moment. The silence was no longer empty. It was full of thoughts, of breath, of choices. My hands finally released the crumpled program. It floated down like a leaf, settling at the base of the grave. When I walked back to the car, the driver opened the door without a word. I climbed in, inhaled deeply, and stared out the window as the graveyard receded behind me. For the first time in decades, I realized I wasn't driving away from something. I was driving toward it. The estate hadn't changed. Every painting hung where Franklin insisted, every rug trimmed to the inch. The place was spotless, glistening under chandeliers that felt colder than the rain still dripping from guests' umbrellas at the door. I stepped into the foyer like a guest myself. The air held that scent he always liked: leather, bourbon, and something sterile. A home meant to impress, not welcome. Voices echoed softly, muffled by carpet and careful etiquette. The wake had begun. Servers moved silently through clusters of mourners, offering flutes of champagne and small plates that looked too delicate to touch. I stood near the piano, watching, but not engaging. I had learned the art of invisibility long ago. One woman, Franklin's former business partner's wife, I think, offered her condolences. "You must feel so lost," she said, her hand brushing my arm like a feather. I gave her the expression I had perfected over the years, a soft, practiced smile. It meant, "Thank you. Now go away." From across the room, Griffin was talking with our lawyer. I could tell by his posture, stiff, rehearsed, that he was navigating logistics, not grief. Clara hovered near him, tight-lipped and composed. Her black dress fit too perfectly, her movements choreographed like she was performing widowhood by proxy. When our eyes met, she nodded once, then turned away. I drifted from group to group, my words few and meaningless. "Yes, thank you." He passed peacefully. "We're managing." All lies, of course. Franklin's death may have been quiet, but peace had nothing to do with it. The grand dining room was prepared like it was hosting a gala. Too many candles, too much silver. I paused near the fireplace, the same one Franklin used to lecture in front of when Griffin was a boy. "A man must command," he would say, standing tall in a tailored vest, brandy in hand. "A family is a ship, no room for mutiny." And we, his family, were just passengers, sometimes cargo. A guest murmured something about how Franklin would be missed in the boardroom. Another mentioned how dignified the service had been. I smiled again like a porcelain doll, hollow and unmoved. Then I saw it. The portrait, hung above the mantel. Franklin, painted 2 years before his death, regal, commanding, posed with a hand resting on a globe. Griffin stood beside him, one hand on his father's shoulder. I was there too, slightly behind, dressed in muted tones. An accessory. The frame was tilted just slightly, maybe an inch off level. That 1 inch burned my eyes. Delilah appeared beside me, quietly. "Still looks like he owns the room," she said, her voice low. I nodded. "Even now. You okay?" "No," I whispered, "but I'm used to it." She reached into her purse and handed me a tissue, not for tears, I hadn't cried, but for pretense. She knew me well enough not to press. In the hallway, I found Clara whispering to someone on the phone, her voice low, sharp. "The house is in order. We'll proceed by the terms. No need for additional delays." She turned and noticed me. Her face shifted. Polite smile, insincere eyes. I walked past her. Griffin found me minutes later in the sunroom, staring out at the garden. "We'll need to meet with the estate attorney next week," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I assumed as much," I replied without looking at him. He stepped closer. "There's a lot to process. We'll need clarity." "Clarity," I echoed. "That's one thing this house never had." He didn't respond. Then, as if rehearsed, "I know this is difficult. If there's anything you need, we'll help organize it." He meant stay out of the way. Let the men handle it. Just like his father always did. Before I could answer, the mortician approached with a bundle of Franklin's remaining belongings. Watch, cufflinks, his jacket folded neatly. Griffin reached for the items. But something dropped from the inner pocket as he took them. A small black key. It hit the hardwood with a dull clang. We both looked down. A safe key. Familiar. I recognized it, though I'd only seen it once. The one he used for his study's hidden drawer, the one he said held work matters. Griffin picked it up, said nothing, and pocketed it. "Probably just business records," he muttered. I said nothing. I waited until the guests had gone, until the food was picked clean, the champagne flat, and the servers vanished like ghosts. Griffin and Clara said they'd check on me soon, then left with the same precision they'd arrived. The estate felt even colder once the last car disappeared down the long gravel drive. I moved through the halls like a stranger. I passed the family portrait again. Still crooked. I didn't fix it. Instead, I went into Franklin's study. Everything was as he left it. Dark wood, heavy books, papers stacked with military precision. I traced my fingers along the shelf, stopping at the thickest book, his favorite biography on Churchill. The dust on the top edge was lighter than the others. Suspiciously so. I pulled it out. Behind it, tucked carefully in the wall molding, was an envelope. Thick, sealed, my name was not on it. I turned it over. On the back, in Franklin's precise script, read, "For Griffin only, open alone." It was dated 7 days before his death. My fingers trembled. I didn't open it. Instead, I sat in Franklin's chair, the envelope in my lap, and stared at the fireless hearth. I wondered what a man says when he knows the end is near, what final message he deems important. Knowing Franklin, it wasn't sentiment. It was strategy. A message meant to control even from the grave. I placed the envelope in a drawer and locked it. Not to protect it, but to delay it. Just for tonight. I needed one more night where the unknown didn't carry his voice. As I sat in that room, alone in the house we built together, I didn't feel like a widow. I felt like a prisoner with the cell door finally swinging open, but I hadn't walked through it yet. Not yet. I remember the first night in this house like it happened last week. We had just returned from our honeymoon in Bermuda. I still smelled of salt water and expensive perfume. Franklin carried me through the threshold like something out of a movie. And for a moment, I believed I was walking into a dream. The house gleamed with polished wood and towering windows. "You'll love it here," he said. "It's perfect for a wife." I was 21, hopeful, naive, in love, or what I thought was love. Mostly, I was eager to be loved. Franklin was older, poised, self-assured. When he spoke, people listened. He made me feel chosen, special, and then, very quickly, small. He didn't start with cruelty. He started with concern. "That dress is a little much, don't you think?" he'd ask with a kind smile. "I just want you to look elegant, not desperate." At dinner, "You're not eating that, are you? It's so heavy, and you've been trying to watch your figure." I laughed, brushed it off, adjusted. Over time, I stopped wearing red. I started ordering salads. I lost touch with friends slowly. A missed call here, a declined invitation there. "You don't need those people anymore," he'd say, rubbing my back. They'll just confuse you. When my college roommate invited me to her wedding, Franklin claimed he had an emergency client dinner. You should stay, he said. Show them where your priorities are. I did. Soon the calls stopped coming altogether. The house became my whole world. Franklin ran the outside and I tended the inside. I arranged flowers. I learned how to host a dinner for 30 without blinking. I studied his moods like scripture, and when I did something he didn't like, forgot to refill his scotch, left laundry unfolded, he didn't raise his voice. That would have been too obvious. Instead, he gave me silence. The long, icy kind. The kind that made the walls feel tighter. Once I cried during a disagreement. Just tears, no shouting. He looked at me like I'd betrayed him. You make everything so dramatic, Lucille, he said. No wonder people don't take you seriously. I didn't cry in front of him again for years. The gaslighting crept in like smoke, no fire, no alarms, just the slow suffocation of reality. You're forgetting things, he'd say when I challenged a detail. You get so emotional, it clouds your judgment. After a while, I began to doubt my memory. Was I exaggerating? Was he right? Money was another form of management. I never worked after we married, Franklin insisted. A real man provides, he'd say. So I depended on him. For everything. Groceries, gifts for friends, even gas. He gave me an allowance, cash in an envelope every week, and asked for receipts. Just to keep things organized. I didn't think to question it at the time. After all, it was more than my mother ever had. She used to say, "It's not about being happy, it's about being stable." When I confided in her once, just once, about how Franklin monitored my phone calls, she sighed and said, "Men have their ways. You married a provider. Adjust. Make it work." My father nodded silently beside her. So I did what women in my family had always done. I made it work. At least, that's what I told myself as the insomnia began. At first, it was one night a week, then two, then every night. I lay awake counting ceiling beams while Franklin snored beside me. My hands clenched under the covers, heart racing for no clear reason. I stopped dreaming. I woke up tired and unsure of who I was becoming. Anxiety crept in quietly, settling in my chest like a stone. My appetite vanished. I took up yoga, meditation, herbal teas, anything to soothe the edges of a life that looked perfect from the outside, but felt like slow erasure. I stopped reading. I stopped writing. I stopped laughing. I became, as Franklin once described approvingly, a woman who knows how to maintain composure. Years passed like shadows. Griffin grew, molded under his father's gaze. He studied Franklin's gestures, mimicked his tone. When he got his first suit, Franklin adjusted the cuffs and said, "Now you look like someone worth listening to." Griffin glowed. And then Clara came. Polished, reserved, sharp in ways Franklin adored. When Griffin brought her to dinner the first time, Franklin watched her like a proud investor. She laughed at his jokes, admired the house, complimented my cooking. But there was something in her smile, a calculation I recognized all too well. Within months, Franklin had pulled her into the fold completely. He praised her constantly. "Clara understands structure," he said. "She'll keep Griffin focused." I should have seen it then, how he was grooming her the same way he'd groomed me. But by then, I had shrunk so far inward, I didn't know how to sound alarms even when I saw the fire. Clara began to echo his judgments. She'd say things like, "Lucille, you always take things too personally." Or, "You're so sensitive, you make people nervous." Once, when I mentioned I was considering going back to school, she blinked and said, "At your age? That's ambitious." She called me dramatic, just like Franklin had. One morning, a few years before Franklin's death, I was cleaning out the guest room closet when I found an old mirror. It was from my first year in the house. The frame was cracked at the corner, and a thin fracture ran diagonally across the glass. I had stored it after Franklin said it was too small and outdated for the main hallway. I brought it upstairs, leaned it against the wall in my bedroom, and stared into it. The reflection felt foreign. A pale woman in beige stood staring back, eyes tired, shoulders hunched. I touched the crack gently. My finger split into two halves in the glass. That mirror stayed there for years. I never replaced it. Franklin walked past it hundreds of times and never said a word. Now, standing in that same room, I run my finger along the jagged edge again. The light from the hallway slants across the mirror, making the crack glint like a scar. This house was a cage, not made of bars but of gestures, permissions, and expectations. I hadn't escaped it yet, not really. But I could see the lock now. I could hear the mechanism clicking loose, one layer of truth at a time. And I knew whatever Franklin left behind in that envelope wasn't meant to comfort. It was meant to bind. But this time I wouldn't let it. It was nearly midnight when I opened the envelope. The study was cold, the scent of Franklin's aftershave still lingering faintly on the leather chair. I'd set the envelope on the desk earlier, unopened, letting it taunt me from the edge of the wood. The handwriting was his. Exact. Controlled. The last words he would ever put to paper. I didn't hesitate now. The letter inside was typed. Of course it was. Franklin never trusted emotion with ink. Only directives. To my son, Griffin William Evers, it began. The next paragraph read like a business memo, stiff, impersonal, meticulous. Financial directives, transfer of trust funds, property titles, stocks, bonds, real estate accounts. Every asset Franklin controlled now belonged to Griffin, with one condition. Ensure your mother does not sell the estate. That single sentence sat in its own line. A command, not a request. I read it twice. There was no mention of me elsewhere, no farewell, no gratitude, no assurance that he believed I would be taken care of. Not even a lie. My name was nowhere on the will, no joint clauses, no protective measures, just silence, as though I had never existed. Franklin had always believed legacies were crafted with obedience and money, and in his final act, he left me neither. The next morning, I placed the letter on the kitchen table and called Griffin. He arrived within the hour. Clara came too, though she stayed in the car. I handed him the envelope without ceremony. He opened it and read in silence, his eyes scanning quickly. When he reached the line, "Ensure your mother does not sell the estate," he didn't flinch. "That's clear," he said. "That's all you have to say?" He looked at me. He wanted to protect the property. You know how much it meant to him. I lived in this house for 35 years. I scrubbed the floors, made every dinner, hosted every party, and he left it to you like I was a tenant. Griffin's voice remained steady. He knew you wouldn't understand the financial logistics. I blinked. Did he say that? Or did you? He didn't answer. We sat in silence for a moment. The kind that felt like a wall rising between us, one brick at a time. "I'll manage the assets," he said eventually, standing. "You'll be comfortable." "I don't want comfort, Griffin. I want respect." He paused at the door. Sometimes they're the same thing. And just like that, he was gone. I stood in the kitchen, my hands shaking, not from fear, but from the rage building quietly, steadily. Franklin hadn't just erased me from his estate. He'd turned my own son into his executor, both of will and willpower. But I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I walked straight to the study. The air in there had always been thick, Franklin's throne room. No one else used the space. Every item was curated. His desk was a fortress, the bookshelves towering, alphabetized. His chair still faced the window, angled toward the garden he never tended but took credit for. I walked to the shelves and began pulling books down, not recklessly, methodically. The biographies first, political leaders, CEOs men Franklin idolized. They landed in boxes with dull thuds, one after the other. Next came the leather-bound classics, then the economics textbooks from his MBA years. I packed everyone. My hands ached, my knees cracked. Still, I kept going. And then I saw it. A thick, burgundy-bound journal, unlabeled, tucked behind a first-edition biography on Carnegie. Something about its placement felt purposeful, or perhaps deliberately hidden. I pulled it free. It wasn't a journal, not exactly. Inside were documents, legal ones, old. My name stared back at me from a property deed dated 1992, the year we moved in. Lucille Margaret Evers, owner. My breath caught. I flipped the page. Another deed, dated 3 years later. This one listed Franklin as the sole owner. The change had been executed quietly, efficiently, no divorce, no contest. Just a name replaced, like a deleted sentence. I sat down hard on the edge of the desk, clutching the papers. He had stolen the house, not in anger, not in haste, in secret, in silence. A removal so quiet, I hadn't even known I was gone. I stared out the window, the garden blurred behind glass. Franklin hadn't just controlled me in life. He had laid traps in death, built snares from paper and ink. But this slip, this forgotten book, was his mistake. And it was mine to hold. For the first time in days, I felt something unfamiliar rise in me. Not grief, not fear, power. I packed the journal into my bag, walked back to the portrait in the living room and stared at it. The crooked frame still tilted. I didn't straighten it. I didn't need to anymore. The red scarf was soft against my throat, warm in a way I hadn't let myself feel in years. Franklin hated red. Said it was too loud, too desperate. "You're not trying to look cheap, are you?" he once asked, eyes flicking from the scarf to my face. That day, I folded it neatly and tucked it into the back of my drawer. I hadn't worn it since. Now I wore it deliberately. It was the first thing I reached for that morning, followed by a lavender blouse he'd once called juvenile. My reflection in the mirror startled me at first. The woman looking back wore color. She stood straighter somehow. She looked intentional. I walked into the kitchen and poured a cup of coffee, the scent grounding me. Sunlight poured through the window, illuminating the floor like a path. I followed it outside without thinking, my slippers crunching lightly against the stone steps. I ended up by the pond. It was a small, still body of water tucked at the edge of the garden, mostly forgotten now, overgrown. Franklin hated its messiness, said it was an eyesore, and wanted to have it filled in. I'd convinced him to leave it, telling him it added value to the land. Really, it was the only place I'd ever felt peace here. I knelt by the edge, leaves shifting under my weight, and looked down. My reflection wavered with the water's surface, soft, lined with time but present. I remembered the first time I found this pond. We'd only just moved in. I was 22, and Franklin had gone on his first extended business trip after our wedding. I'd spent a full day out here, barefoot, reading and sketching and writing letters I never sent. When he returned, I told him I'd found the pond and loved it. He frowned. "Don't waste time down there. Looks like something you'd find behind a gas station." The next day, the gardener began clearing the brush. I didn't go back for years. Now, the silence felt different, not oppressive, freeing. I dipped my hand into the water, cool, real. I let the pond show me who I'd been, who I might be again. Later that afternoon, I found myself in the parlor, staring at the wall of books I hadn't touched in years. My fingers trailed over spines I once loved, Woolf, Plath, Dickinson. I pulled one down, opened to a page marked with an old receipt, and found a line underlined in faded ink. "I am rooted, but I flow." I smiled. I remembered underlining it. Franklin had scoffed when I read it aloud once. "Nonsense," he'd said. "People either stand firm or they fall apart." I'd said nothing. But I remembered how the words had made me feel, anchored and limitless at the same time. That evening, Delilah called. Her number lit up my screen like a forgotten melody. I let it ring twice before answering. "You wore the scarf," she said. No greeting, just warmth. "I did," I replied. "I think he'd be rolling in his grave." "Then maybe you're doing something right." She came over the next morning with croissants and a bottle of wine we didn't open. She sat on my couch like she belonged there, like no time had passed since college dorms and midnight confessions. "You look different," she said, eyes narrowing. "Not sad. Not really." "I don't know what I am," I admitted. "You're thawing," she said. "It's going to feel strange." We sipped coffee and watched the trees move. Eventually, she turned serious. "Lucille, can I say something hard? Please. I tried to warn you, years ago. Do you remember that dinner party at the Stinsons?" I did. Vaguely. The night Franklin made that joke about wives being softer when quiet. I'd laughed. Everyone had. Delilah had said, "That's a cruel thing to say." Franklin smiled coldly. "Delilah, not every man wants to marry a protest sign." People laughed harder. I went cold. "I remember," I whispered. "That was the last time I was invited to your house." I nodded. "He didn't like pushback. He punished you for it, through silence, through shame. That's what they do." We sat with that truth between us, like something too heavy to lift and too sacred to ignore. "You still have time," she said, "to claim something." "What if I don't know what I want?" "You will," she said, "when you stop asking what he would have allowed." That night, I returned to my bedroom. The cracked mirror still leaned against the wall. I hadn't moved it since the funeral. I stood before it now, wrapped in my red scarf, hair loose, face bare. This time I didn't flinch. The crack was still there, but it no longer split me in half. It framed me. A line, a history, a scar, but not a wound. Not anymore. The kitchen smelled like oatmeal and quiet disappointment. That's how I remember childhood. Our house was always clean, but never warm. My father read the newspaper every morning with military precision, flipping the pages with an economy of movement that warned against interruption. My mother stood at the stove, back straight, eyes low. She made her life fit into tight corners, folded napkins, measured meals, careful silences. Good wives don't raise their voices, she told me once when I was 10 and dared to say I didn't like the pink dress she'd picked. You'll understand when you're married. And I did. Too well. My father spoke in commands, not conversations. Sit up, finish your food, be respectful. I learned to nod instead of speak, to measure value in obedience. My mother never argued, never pushed back. Her job was to support him, quietly, graciously. Her pride was in her endurance, so mine became the same. By the time I met Franklin at a political fundraiser, I thought I was lucky. He reminded me of my father, articulate, firm, in control. I mistook that for strength. I mistook attention for affection. When he corrected my posture during our third date, I thought, he cares. When he suggested I switch majors to something more stable, I thought, he sees my potential. When he asked me to marry him 6 months later, I said yes before I'd even asked myself why. Only now, years later, do I see the layers, the inheritance of silence, the way I believed suffering was noble, a mark of womanhood. The more I endured, the more worthy I thought I was. Grief has a strange way of peeling back the skin. One morning, days after finding the deed, I opened an old leather-bound journal I'd never written in. It had been a gift from Franklin, back when gifts were still part of the game. He once said, "You could write in this if you ever get tired of talking." I smiled, placed it on a shelf, and never touched it again. Now, I uncapped a pen and wrote a sentence I'd never spoken out loud. I thought love meant disappearing quietly. The words looked strange on the page, like they belonged to someone braver, but they were mine. I wrote for hours. Not poetry, not fiction, just fragments of memories I'd buried to keep peace. I wrote about the night Franklin told me I was too emotional to be trusted with financial decisions, about the time he called my voice shrill during a dinner party, about the night he made me sleep in the guest room because I questioned a client's behavior. I wrote it all. The more I wrote, the more I remembered. And the more I remembered, the more I burned. Delilah came by again, unannounced, holding a box of old letters and photographs. She was sorting her mother's things and thought I might want to see some of our college memories. We sat cross-legged on the living room floor, passing time through pictures. We laughed, then we cried. Then she grew quiet. "You look lighter," she said finally. "I'm writing," I replied. "Things I should have said years ago." She leaned in. "What if grief isn't just sadness? What if it's freedom?" I exhaled. Then maybe I'm grieving right. Later that week, I walked into a therapist's office. Not because I was broken, but because I needed someone who wouldn't excuse him. The room was soft, muted blues, no ticking clocks, a worn rug. The therapist, a woman named Dana, had gentle eyes and a voice that didn't flinch. "What brings you in?" she asked. I hesitated. Then slowly, "He never hit me, but he broke me." She nodded like she'd heard it before, too many times. "I thought if I just endured long enough, things would balance. They never did? They only bent more." That first session opened something in me. I left exhausted but full, like my lungs had made more space. That night, I stood in front of the cracked mirror again, this time in bare feet and a nightgown Franklin hated. My reflection no longer startled me. It studied me back. And then the phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. "Mrs. Evers?" a male voice asked. "Yes. This is Everett Hayes with Raymond and Barrister Legal. I'm calling about a property that recently came to our attention during a routine audit of Mr. Franklin Evers' holdings." My chest tightened. "What kind of property?" He cleared his throat. "An apartment, registered under Lucille Margaret Whitaker. That's your maiden name, correct?" I gripped the phone tighter. That's correct. It's in a private building on West 86th. Ownership hasn't changed since 1998. Property taxes have been paid consistently from a separate account tied to Mr. Evers, but there's no activity otherwise. It's essentially untouched. I didn't know it existed, I said. I figured. Most clients don't forget a Manhattan apartment. Was it in the will? No mention. Can you send me the address? Of course. I'd recommend checking it soon. I hung up and stood motionless in the hallway. A property. In my name. Unmentioned, untouched, hidden, 25 years. That would have been shortly after Griffin was born. My hand brushed the journal again. He never hit me, but he broke me. And now, maybe I was going to rebuild. The doorman didn't recognize me. Not that he would have. The name on the mailbox was still mine, Lucille Margaret Whitaker. But the woman who used to live behind that name hadn't existed in decades. The key turned with a hollow click. The door creaked open into a chamber of dust and stillness. The apartment smelled of time, not decay, just disuse. A faint trace of lavender still lingered from a sachet I must have tucked into a drawer long ago. The curtains were drawn, the air dry. I flipped the switch. The lights flickered, then hummed to life. My heels echoed on the hardwood floor as I stepped inside. The living room was almost exactly how I remembered it. The same velvet couch, now faded to a dull blue-gray. The bookshelf still held dog-eared paperbacks, spines creased and familiar. My mug, white with a blue floral rim, sat forgotten on the windowsill, a ring of dust encircling it like a halo. I didn't cry. Not yet. I walked slowly, fingers grazing each object, each remnant of a version of myself that had once been whole. This place had been my first solo space. Franklin had helped me lease it during our engagement, said it would be a test of independence. At the time, I thought it romantic, liberating. But I only lived here 6 months before he asked me to move in with him permanently. Now I knew it wasn't a test, it was an expiration. In the bedroom, I found a shoebox tucked inside the closet. Familiar handwriting scrawled on its lid. To my almost wife. I lifted the top. Inside were letters, notes, even scribbled poems. The first few were charming, warm, romantic in the way only early Franklin could be. He called me my rare bird, and wrote that I made the world feel less jagged. But the tone shifted slowly. One letter read, "You spend too much time at the library. I wonder sometimes if you're avoiding me." Another, "You looked bored at dinner. That's not the woman I agreed to marry." I read them all. Watched the affection turn into criticism, the warmth into surveillance. At the bottom of the box, folded and yellowing, was a note I didn't recognize. It wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to Dee. I unfolded it with shaking hands. "I know what we had can't be public, but I can't let it go. Elle is fragile. She can't know. I need time to sort this. Wait for me." I sat on the edge of the bed, lungs hollowing out. There were other letters, too. Receipts from weekend getaways I never took. Photos of Franklin standing beside a woman I didn't know, dark-haired and smiling, holding a baby whose eyes looked disturbingly familiar. The walls of the apartment suddenly felt closer, the air heavier. I staggered to the kitchen, set the letters on the counter, and broke. It started with a sharp inhale, then a cry that ripped from somewhere deep in my ribs. I collapsed onto the floor, knees folding, palms slapping tile. I sobbed into the dust and the silence, for every version of me that had swallowed her voice, for every lie I accepted because it felt safer than truth, for the dreams I'd filed away, traveling, teaching, writing, for the children I raised in his shadow, for the woman who stood in the mirror for 30 years, asking permission to be real. I wept until my body ached, and then I sat up. The kitchen window was small, smudged, streaked with grime. I stood, opened it. The breeze was sharp, slicing into the stale air, carrying the scent of the city. Exhaust, bagels, life. I threw open the curtains. Light crashed into the room. The dust danced in it. I began cleaning, not furiously, deliberately. I scrubbed the countertop, wiped the books, vacuumed the hallway. I changed the sheets on the bed. I opened every window, let the ghosts scatter. Then I lit a candle. It was a small lavender votive I found in a drawer. The flame flickered, uncertain at first, then strong. I moved through the apartment slowly, a new inhabitant claiming her space. In the hallway, I found a photo album. At the very back was a picture of me, standing by the window of this apartment, barefoot, laughing. A book in one hand, a coffee in the other. My hair was wild. My eyes were alive. I held it close. This was who I was before I was reshaped, before obedience, before legacy. This apartment wasn't just a secret Franklin kept. It was a map he never meant for me to follow. But now I had, and I wasn't leaving. The sun was low when I returned to the estate. The air held that strange golden warmth that came before dusk, soft and fleeting. I didn't go straight inside. Instead, I sat in the car, the photo of me in the apartment clutched like a secret in my purse. The contrast between who I was then and who I'd been pretending to be inside that house was stark enough to cut. I stepped through the front door with the deliberate calm of someone holding a loaded truth. Griffin was already there, sitting in Franklin's study, flipping through documents. He looked up as I entered, eyes scanning mine for something. Fatigue, maybe? Compliance. Instead, he found resolve. "I need to ask you something," I said. He set the folder down. "Okay. How long have you known about the apartment?" The question landed with more weight than my tone gave it. His eyes shifted, just enough to betray him. "I knew it existed," he admitted after a moment. "Dad mentioned it years ago, said it was a closed chapter." "A closed chapter?" He said it wasn't relevant, just something from before. Before what, Griffin? Before me? Or before he decided what parts of me were worth keeping? He exhaled. "It was Dad's business. I didn't ask questions." I stared at him. "You were raised by a tyrant," I said, voice low. His jaw clenched. "So were you." Silence. It wasn't a defensive reply. It was a confession. And for the first time, I saw him. Not just the echo of Franklin, but the boy who had learned to survive under his roof. But then his mask slid back on. "This isn't about the apartment," he said. "It's about control. You don't like how Dad handled things, and now you're rewriting history." "No, I'm finally reading it." He stood, suddenly impatient. "Look, I get that this is emotional for you, but we can't undo the legal decisions. The estate is settled." "Legally, maybe, but not honestly." His eyes narrowed. "Is this Clara's doing?" I blinked. "What?" He hesitated, then scoffed, as if he'd said too much, but I pressed. "What about Clara?" He didn't answer directly, but the pause gave him away. "She encouraged you to take control of everything, didn't she? The assets, the property, the legacy?" "She thought it was the responsible thing to do." "No, she thought it was an opportunity." He didn't deny it. I turned and walked into the hallway, toward the grand living room. The portrait still hung above the fireplace, Franklin's painted eyes forever looking down on his domain. I stood beneath it, the silence coiling. I took it off the wall. The weight of it shocked me. It was heavier than it looked, the frame thick with brass and self-importance. I leaned it against the wall, face turned to the side. Griffin watched from the doorway. "What are you doing?" "Clearing the space," I said. He didn't ask what for. That evening I called a lawyer, not Franklin's, not the firm that had taken his side for decades. Someone new, independent, a woman recommended by Delilah who specialized in estate disputes, especially those tangled in secrecy. Her name was Marla Grant, and she listened carefully as I outlined everything: the apartment, the letters, the absence of my name, the buried documents. She didn't flinch. "If there's a discrepancy in the will's amendment or its timeline, you may have legal standing. It depends on what we can prove." "What if I told you Franklin was known to forge signatures to protect his control?" "Then we start there." She requested every version of the will, every amendment, every notarized file. Within days, she called me back. "Lucille," she said, "I think we found something." My breath caught. "One of the final amendments. The one that excluded you entirely. It appears to have been notarized by someone who died before the date on the signature." I blinked. "Are you sure?" I double-checked. "It's a forged timestamp. That amendment isn't valid." I sank into the chair, the weight of the revelation washing over me like cold water. "Which means you have a case, a real one. If we file a motion, we can contest the entire distribution." I hung up and walked back into the hallway. The portrait still leaned against the wall, Franklin's face half lit by a shaft of moonlight. He'd controlled everything: timelines, money, narratives. But he hadn't accounted for this, for me. Still standing, still looking, still ready to take it back. The courtroom was colder than I expected, bright but sterile. Every surface gleaming like a warning. The hum of fluorescent lights above mingled with the quiet rustling of papers and polite throat clears. Franklin would have hated it. Too informal. Too exposed. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside Marla, my new attorney, who reviewed the file with a practiced calm. Across from us, Griffin and Clara sat with their counsel, all tailored suits and measured confidence. Clara wore pearls. Griffin looked like he was preparing to deliver a keynote speech, not defend a lie. He didn't meet my eyes. When the judge entered, everyone stood. His presence was understated but commanding. Judge Barrick was known for being impartial, unshakable. I wondered what kind of men had stood before him over the years, their legacies unraveling under oath. The proceedings began. The opposing counsel laid out their case swiftly. Franklin's will, its amendments, the transfer of assets to Griffin. They spoke of Franklin's mental clarity, his generational foresight, his deep concern for the long-term stability of the estate. They didn't mention me until they had to. "She was provided for," the lawyer said, motioning vaguely in my direction. "Within reason." When it was our turn, Marla stood with a quiet kind of gravity. No dramatic gestures, just precision. "We contest the final amendment on 2 grounds," she said. "Fraud and intentional misrepresentation. We will show that not only did Franklin Evers forge documentation, but he also deliberately concealed assets and altered legal standing to isolate and deprive Mrs. Lucille Evers of her rightful inheritance." Then it was my turn. The bailiff asked me to swear in. I raised my right hand, my voice steady. I sat in the witness box, the wooden armrests cool beneath my fingers. I could feel eyes on me. Griffin's, Clara's, strangers from the gallery. They were waiting for emotion, for collapse, but I had already done all my collapsing. This was something else. Marla began. "Mrs. Evers, can you describe your role in the management of the estate during your marriage?" "I wasn't given a role," I said plainly. "I lived there, I hosted, I supported my husband, I raised our son, but I was never part of the financial decisions." "Were you aware that the estate was, at one point, listed in your name?" "Yes. I found the original deed. Franklin changed it without informing me." She handed the deed to the clerk, who passed it to the judge. "And the signature on the amendment removing you?" I nodded. "Forged. The notary died months before the document was signed." A murmur rippled through the room. Clara shifted uncomfortably. Marla continued, now holding my journal. "With your permission, I'll read a passage dated March 12, 1999. I nodded. She read aloud. "He told me I was too emotional to be trusted. That silence was easier than argument. I didn't speak for 2 days after that. He didn't notice." The room went quiet. Judge Barrick leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. Marla presented everything. Photos, timelines, the letter found in the apartment. She ended with the analysis from the forensic document expert. "The inconsistencies in ink, date alignment, and notary verification make this amendment invalid," she concluded. The judge looked toward me. "Mrs. Evers, why come forward now?" I didn't hesitate. "Because I believed him when he said I wasn't entitled to anything. Because for years I thought silence was survival. But silence isn't the same as consent. And being loyal to abuse doesn't make you noble. It makes you lost. I want my name back, my life back." Even Clara blinked at that. The judge didn't offer a ruling immediately. He said he would review the material and issue a decision within 10 days. Court was adjourned. Griffin avoided me in the hallway. His shoulders were tense, jaw tight. I almost reached for him just for a second, to ask what part of him still remembered me as his mother. But I didn't. Clara walked beside him, her hand on his back like she was guiding a wounded animal away from a battlefield. The news traveled fast. By that evening, I received 2 calls, former friends, both offering the same syrupy tone. "Lucille, we had no idea." They weren't reaching out to apologize. They were reaching out to distance themselves from the scandal. But I didn't need their comfort. I sat on the back porch, wrapped in a shawl, watching the wind move through the trees. The house behind me was still. For once, it wasn't humming with Franklin's decisions. It was quiet, and that quiet wasn't oppressive. It was mine. The ruling came in the form of a letter, black ink on cream paper, delivered in an unremarkable envelope that felt like anything but. The language was formal, but the verdict was clear. The court finds sufficient cause to invalidate the contested amendment. The estate shall revert to its previous terms, granting Lucille Margaret Evers full rights to property and assets formerly contested. I folded the letter carefully. Then I laughed, soft and short, a sound that felt foreign in the hallway that had swallowed so many of my silences. For the first time in my adult life, I owned something that couldn't be taken back. The house was mine, not just in deed, but in meaning. I walked through it slowly barefoot, the cold wood under my feet grounding me. Each room was different now, not because the furniture had changed, but because I had. The walls no longer echoed Franklin's voice. The floor no longer carried the weight of his footsteps. The portrait was gone, replaced with a blank wall that I had yet to fill. My first act as the rightful owner of the estate was simple. Franklin's prized Jaguar, the one he waxed every Sunday and never let anyone else drive, was donated to a women's shelter fundraiser. I signed the title over with a flourish, watched the tow truck haul it down the long driveway. The silence it left behind was better than the engine had ever sounded. My second act was louder. I invited women from all corners of my life. Delilah, of course, and others too. Women who had whispered their stories at baby showers, who had gone quiet when certain names were mentioned. Women I hadn't seen in years because Franklin didn't like their energy. I called them all. We filled the dining room, the kitchen, the porch. We wore colors, bright ones. Someone brought wine. Someone else baked a pie. The rooms that had once been curated for power now pulsed with laughter, honesty, warmth. We told stories. Some were funny, some were brutal. All of them were true. I stood at the center, no longer hosting in the way I once had, serving, pleasing, but claiming space. Delilah caught my eye from across the room, her glass raised in silent recognition. "You did it," she mouthed, and I nodded. Later, when the house was quiet again, I went to my bedroom. The cracked mirror still leaned against the wall. I hadn't replaced it, not yet. But tonight, I was ready. I lifted it gently, carried it to the garage, and placed it on the floor. One swift strike with a hammer, and the glass splintered into a starburst of shards. Then, I began to build. Piece by piece, I created a new mosaic. Not perfect, not symmetrical, but mine. I used parts of that old mirror, bits of colored glass from vases Franklin said clashed with the decor, a chipped plate I'd saved from my first apartment. The result was uneven, alive, unexpected. It reflected me back in fragments, no longer cracked, just reframed. I hung it above my dresser. "This house was his," I said aloud. "Now it's mine." Griffin didn't call. He sent one message: "I need time." I didn't reply. Clara came only once more, quietly, to collect what remained of their belongings. She didn't speak to me. Her eyes held something sharp, not sorrow, bitterness. I offered no hostility, only silence. By the end of the week, the rooms they once occupied were empty, not lonely, just free. I spent hours exploring the parts of the house I'd ignored for years: the attic, the cellar, closets full of memories that had long stopped belonging to me. I opened drawers I hadn't dared to touch in decades, and that's when I found it. A safe. One of Franklin's, smaller than the others, tucked behind the old filing cabinet in the office he rarely let me clean. The key was in the desk, labeled under a false name. Inside there was a bundle of papers, a stack of photos, and a letter. It was addressed to M, not me. The handwriting was Franklin's. I sat down, bracing myself. I can't keep doing this. The guilt is getting worse. She's not stupid, she's just careful. I think she suspects something, and I'm terrified what will happen if she finds out. I can't lose everything, not now. Not after all I've built. The rest of the letter was a confession. Not of love, not really, but of need. Of fear. Of self-preservation. He'd had a relationship, maybe more than one, and he knew deep down that I'd find out. He was right. I closed the safe. I didn't cry. I didn't burn the letter. I simply filed it under the truth, one more piece of the life he built on secrecy. And then I went outside, into the garden, where the wind moved freely through the branches. I sat on the bench by the pond, the one he'd tried to fill in, the one I'd reclaimed. The water was still, and so was I. The estate sold in under 3 weeks. I didn't announce it. No farewell dinner, no family meeting, no call to Griffin, just a listing, a signature, a wire transfer. Silent, strategic. The buyer was a young couple, artists from New York. They wanted the space, not the legacy. When we signed the papers at closing, they told me they planned to paint the study a shade of bright coral. Franklin would have loathed it. I smiled and wished them luck. I didn't feel sorrow handing over the keys. I felt clarity, like setting down a weight I'd carried so long, I'd forgotten what it meant to stand without it. With the funds, I did what Franklin never could. I built something for someone other than myself. The foundation launched quietly at first. No gala, no fanfare. Just a small office, a modest endowment, and a mission. To help women who were rebuilding after emotional, psychological, and financial abuse. Not just shelters, guidance, legal support, community, a place to say the truth out loud and not be asked to whisper. We named it the Whitaker Foundation, after the woman I was before I became someone else's reflection. Delilah joined as a board member. She'd fought her own battles, knew the terrain intimately. Together, we drafted plans, built partnerships, made room for stories that deserved more than silence. Then the local paper picked up the story. Widow turns inheritance into lifeline for women, the Whitaker Foundation opens doors in River Point. The headline was modest, the photo tasteful. Me in front of the small brick office, hands folded, scarf fluttering in the breeze. I thought nothing of it. But Griffin saw it. I know this because the voicemail came at 11:32 p.m., the same night the article ran. I didn't answer the call, but I played the message. Silence then. I saw the article. I guess you really did it. You sold everything. Pause. You did it without even telling me. Another pause, longer this time. I don't know what to say. Then the line went dead. I didn't call back. Instead, I wrote him a letter, my last. Griffin, you once told people to let me grieve quietly, as if silence was all I'd earned. But I was silent for decades. I buried myself long before I buried your father. This isn't grief, this is resurrection. Let her grieve quietly? No. Let her live freely. I signed it simply, Mother. I didn't mail it. I left it on his doorstep with no return address. Some truths don't require acknowledgement. The ashes had sat untouched in the study for months, in a polished urn on the mantel Franklin once deemed too modern. His instructions had been explicit. He wanted them interred beside his parents in the family mausoleum. I had no intention of honoring that. Instead, I drove to the river. It was the same spot he once took me fishing before we were married, back when charm came easily to him, and I didn't yet know it was a mask. The wind was high that day, the current strong. I opened the urn slowly, the lid groaning against the seal. Inside, gray fragments of someone who spent a lifetime building walls around people who loved him. I stood at the edge of the dock and whispered nothing. Then I tipped the urn. The ashes scattered quickly, taken by the wind and swallowed by the current. No ceremony, no prayer, just release. He belonged to the river now. I stood there until the last ripple disappeared, until the sun dropped behind the trees and the shadows folded into the water. Then I turned, walked back to the car, and drove home. Not to the estate, to my apartment, to my life, to the woman who no longer asked permission to be whole. The apartment smelled different now, clean, warm, alive. The old scent of disuse and lavender sachets had been replaced by fresh paint, eucalyptus candles, and something new I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was possibility, or maybe just peace. I'd painted the walls myself, a soft cream for the living room, slate blue for the bedroom. I replaced the yellowed blinds with sheer curtains that caught the breeze and danced like they had nothing to prove. Light streamed in every morning, and I let it. I no longer shut it out to protect a house that wasn't mine. Green plants lined the windowsills, pothos, ferns, a fiddle-leaf fig I named Ruth. They flourished in the sun, unbothered, resilient. A small speaker near the bookshelf played jazz on low, Ella Fitzgerald on Mondays, Miles Davis on Thursdays. I moved to the rhythm of soft horns and velvet voices. In the kitchen, the tea kettle whistled gently. On the counter sat a bowl of lemons. Everything was intentional now. Every object chosen, every space mine. I had pared life down to its most honest parts. No more formal dining rooms or curated living areas. Just a quiet breakfast table with a chipped teacup I loved too much to throw away. Books stacked in uneven towers. A single mug that read, "Begin again." I'd kept the photo from the old apartment, the one of me barefoot holding a book, laughing without knowing anyone was watching. It now hung above my writing desk, framed in oak. Next to it, a corkboard covered in index cards and sticky notes, character sketches, scene ideas, fragments of dialogue. I was writing again. Not about Franklin, not about the pain, about a woman who escaped. A woman who traveled across the country with nothing but a backpack and a map drawn in dreams. A woman who learned that solitude could be sanctuary, that a voice reclaimed could echo louder than any past trying to pull her back. I didn't know yet if it would become a novel, but I wrote every day. Sometimes I wrote about the apartment and how it had once been a place of preparation for a life I never got to live. And now, at last, it was the life, not a rehearsal. Sometimes I wrote about places I wanted to go. Savannah, New Orleans, Lisbon. Sometimes I wrote about love. Not the kind Franklin offered, shaped by possession and power, but a quieter, more curious love. The kind that asks instead of commands. The kind that listens. I wasn't rushing, but I was open. On my nightstand, I kept a small leather-bound journal. At the top of the first page, I'd written in my own handwriting, "What remains is mine." I wrote under it every night. Not what I'd lost, what I was building. My hair had grown longer. I let it curl now, wild and soft around my face. I wore lipstick when I wanted, none when I didn't. I stopped explaining myself for either choice. One afternoon, Delilah came over with a new scarf, deep indigo, flecked with gold. "For the next chapter," she said. We stood at the window, watching the city move below. "Do you regret any of it?" she asked. I thought about it. "I regret staying quiet," I said, "but I don't regret surviving." We clinked our mugs together. That evening, after she left, I lit a candle and stood in front of the mirror I'd hung by the door. It was smaller than the one from the estate. Simpler. No gold trim. Just wood. Smooth and worn. I stared at my reflection. Lines around my eyes. Softness in my jaw. A lightness in my posture I hadn't seen in decades. I smiled. And the woman in the mirror smiled back. Later, as the sun dipped low and painted the apartment in shades of honey and rose, I stood in front of the camera on my desk and took a photo. Not posed, not adjusted, just me, Lucille Whitaker, alone, whole, lit by afternoon sun. I printed it the next morning, framed it, and hung it beside the old one. One woman becoming another, both real, both mine. In the voice I now knew as my own, I wrote one last line in my journal. I lost a husband but found myself. He silenced me in life, but in death, I finally spoke. If this story stirred something quiet inside you, stay with us. The silence you've endured might just be your strength in disguise. We tell the stories others tried to bury, and everyone brings us closer to the truth, one unraveling at a time. Let's keep digging. Don't miss out. If you enjoy impactful and thought-provoking stories, be sure to subscribe for more inspiring content. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new video.